All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Victoria Law. Victoria is the editor of Tenacious, Art and Writings from Women in Prison. She is the co-founder of Books Through Bars, as well as the author of Resistance Behind Bars, Struggles of Incarcerated Women, all of which and more you can find at resistancebehindbars.org. Victoria, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
So, Victoria, you recently wrote a really great piece for Truth Out on the efforts to release some of the aging people from prisons. Let's start out with kind of an overview about what it's like for the lives of the elderly in prison and spending their lives there. Give us a kind of an overview of aging people in prisons.
Well, right now there's approximately 125,000 people behind bars who are ages 55 and older. And as listeners who have older people in their lives, whether it be parents, grandparents, neighbors, other family members or loved ones know, as people age, they have more and more health problems, they have mobility issues, and they're also not the same people that they were when they were, say, 19 or 20 or 25 or 30. So definitely there's, a huge change that comes over people as they age. And when you look at aging people in the prisons and jail settings, you realize that along with this impacted mobility and health issues, there are also ways in which prisons and jails are not equipped to deal with people with infirmities, people who are aging, people who have needs associated with either aging or health issues. So you'll have people who are ages 55, 60, 65, 70 being written up for, say, moving too slowly or for disregarding prison rules that are meant for younger people. You'll see that people are having aging and end-of-life healthcare issues that are being treated at a huge expense to the jails or the prisons, given that medical care is not covered under Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act. And when you add in the cost of treating somebody who is incarcerated, it means hiring extra security or having security escort them to the hospital. So you're paying for 2 armed guards, you're paying for transportation, you're paying for whatever else, in addition to the hospital costs for, say, dialysis or chemotherapy or any other illnesses associated with aging. And then you also just have the moral idea of people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s dying in prison by themselves and alone for something that they did perhaps when they were 20 or 30. So there's no realization that people change as they grow older. And even for people who believe in law and order and safety and security and feel that you need to lock people up so that they are no longer threats to society, what threat does a 75-year-old who can barely move pose to society? Why are we keeping 75-year-old grandma or grandpa locked away, A, at a huge financial cost to society, and B, at a huge moral cost to our society?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain it does get to a certain point that also, I mean, a lot of people who are in the prison population are nonviolent offenders to begin with, but then it actually does get to a certain point where someone is clearly not a threat to society anymore. A 75-year-old is most likely not going to be going on some type of murderous rampage or anything like that.
Yes, and there's also been studies that show that even as people approach, say, middle age, not even old age, they tend to age out of impulsive, destructive behaviors that characterize many of the offenses that might be called violent offenses, such as assault or robbery or other things that they might have done when they were younger. So even somebody who is 55 is not the same person that he or she was when they were 25.
I'm talking to Victoria Law, author of Resistance Behind Bars, resistancebehindbars.org, about her latest piece on Truth Out, which is truthout.org, truth-out.org. So, it seems like it's something that is of great financial cost to our country. It's something that's of great moral cost to our country. And, you're someone who's helping draw attention to that. And you write at Truth Out that there's actually many different angles that people are taking in different states to try to change this problem and actually go about it. Let's go through some of them. Let's start out what people are doing in the state of New York, because they're doing some interesting stuff.
So in New York, there's a campaign that was launched this past year called the Release Aging People from Prison campaign, and it specifically looks at the way that the parole system works in New York State. So there's nothing one can do to change the nature of their conviction or their crime when they appear before the parole board. But again and again, people are seeing that the parole board wasn't taking into account how much people had changed. They were looking at the nature of the crime and saying, well, we don't think you're ready to go back into society yet. And the lead organizer for the RAP campaign, Release Aging People from Prison, is Mujahid Farid, who spent 15 years in prison for committing, what did he do? He committed an armed robbery or an assault on an officer. Attempted murder on a police officer. So this was something he had done in 1978. And every time he went before the parole board, they didn't look at the college degrees he earned in prison. They didn't look at his counseling. They didn't look at any of the other certificates he earned for the programs he had done. They didn't look at what he was doing to change himself. They looked at that original conviction from 1978 and said, no, you are not eligible. Come back later. Come back later. And then he was granted parole in 2011, and no one has any idea what changed for the parole board. They suddenly weren't looking at the nature of conviction. But again, he is not the same person in even 2000 that he was in 1978. So you could see how people age out of behaviors that might be harmful, antisocial, violent as they grow older. So he started talking with other advocates and formerly incarcerated people about the fact that so many aging people in prison go before the parole board and they're sent back to prison and told to come back again in 2 years simply because of the nature of their conviction. And when they looked at the parole regulations that had been revised within the past few years, they realized that there was a way to hold the parole board to these regulations and to say, you need to be looking at risk assessments, current risk assessments, not risk assessments from 12 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when the person was young and committed the crime. You have to look at what they've been doing in the meantime and really and truly look at what risk do they pose to society if you let them out versus what do we gain from keeping somebody in here. So for the 15 years that Farid was inside, what could he have been doing on the outside had he gotten parole 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier if the parole board had said, actually, you seem to have done a remarkable job at transforming yourself. You understand that what you did was harmful and wrong, and we're going to let you out. And what could we have both saved in terms of finances, and what could perhaps the city and the state have gained in terms of somebody who has this kind of knowledge and these kinds of leadership skills out in the community? What could he have done to, say, work with other people around social justice issues had he not been locked up for 15 years?